Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I was just commenting on how well disciplined you are. 6 p.m. sharp, and you're all in here. I hope you enjoyed that reception provided by the Teachers Federation, and welcome to each and every one of you. Well, I know we're looking forward to tonight with such a distinguished guest speaker as Pasi Sahlberg, and I will ask our Australian Education Union Federal President, Angelo Gavrielatos, to introduce Pasi shortly. But just first, some opening remarks. I do want to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land, to Aboriginal elders past and present, and affirm that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to tender an apology from both our President, Maury Mulheron, and our Senior Vice President, Joan Lemaire, from the Federation's leadership. They're otherwise engaged, Maury overseas and Joan intrastate, and I know they would have liked to have been here for such a great occasion. I'd also like to acknowledge some distinguished guests tonight, but when I use the word distinguished, I actually think you've all distinguished yourselves tonight by being here. But in particular, and when I looked at this list, I thought we are in a time of enlightenment, of political alignment, because the four names I've got here to welcome, first of all, Adrian Piccoli, National Party Education Minister from New South Wales. Greens New South Wales Member of Parliament, John Kay. I also believe Catherine Cusack, representing the New South Wales Premier Mike Baird, is to attend tonight, but I haven't caught up with Catherine. Yeah, great. Good to see you. Thanks, Catherine. My apologies, I didn't catch you. And Verity Firth, former Labor Education Minister in New South Wales. And you can see from that list why I talk about the age of enlightenment in terms of broad support for schools funding reform in this nation. And indeed, the names of those four people and their parties, we've got the National Party, the Liberal Party, the Greens, and a former Labor Member of Parliament represented here. And I think that says much about the degree to which we in New South Wales have politicians who are prepared to put politics aside and put our students first in advocating for schools funding reform. All credit to them. They ought to be highly commended for the commitment they've shown to our students in New South Wales public schools. And can I say that we look forward with some optimism to the state budget tomorrow, where we hope that, my apologies for that, where we hope that we will see a New South Wales coalition government commitment to implementing the full 6 years of Gonski funding reform. No pressure, Minister Piccoli, no pressure. I'll now call on Angelo Gavrielatos to introduce Pasi Sahlberg to you.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, and can I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I also say it's great to be home. I always like being home back in New South Wales, particularly in this auditorium. I just want to make two observations before we invite Pasi to deliver his lecture this evening. The first of which is an extension of what Gary said. It's not lost on me, it's never been lost on me in the last number of months that New South Wales remains in the vanguard of our ongoing campaign to achieve a better funding system for our kids, and that needs to be acknowledged. As I go around the country speaking to ministers in every single state and territory, what I always know is that New South Wales from the Premier to the Minister and others, continues to support real funding reform in the interest of schools getting the resources they need so that our students can achieve their best possible outcomes. And I'm proud to be able to say that, to be associated with that and recognise that that will continue into the future. And Adrian, I acknowledge your role and national leadership on this question to date. On another matter, can I say that today is the International Day of the African Child. And I think it's important for us to note that we wrote to every single Director General across the country about 5 or 6 weeks ago, asking them to partner with us, to join with us, to encourage all schools to note and mark the significance of the International Day of the African Child. The New South Wales Director General, Michelle Brunigis, was the first to meet that challenge and join with us in encouraging schools to reflect today, particularly in the context of what continues to shock us, to cause such disbelief. And of course I'm referring to the plight of the more than 200 girls in Nigeria who continue to be held hostages by Boko Haram. It's just an appalling set of circumstances. Without dwelling any more on those issues, it's my great pleasure to introduce a great friend of public education. A great friend of public education who some years ago committed himself and set himself an objective, a goal, and that is to save public education from a germ which he continues to attempt to inoculate around the world as he travels, speaking with friends as he is tonight, calling on us to mobilise and become even more active in the interests of public education, recognising the transformative power of public education and what it means to each individual child and nations as a whole. It's with that great pleasure that I introduce Pasi tonight. He contacted me a couple of months ago and he said he's going to be on the east coast of Australia, and he said, what do you reckon we can organise? I said, well, have I got plans for you? And so tonight he's in New South Wales here. On Wednesday night he's speaking in Parliament House. In Parliament House, Canberra. It is a sitting week, and that the political significance of that. And of course, and we finish on Thursday in Melbourne, and his speaking tour has already attracted significant media attention. In addition to print media, today he's done television media with ABC TV, Radio National, and ongoing media interest as part of his tour. Let me welcome a great friend, Pasi Sahlberg.
Wow, good evening. How are you people? Good day. It's wonderful, wonderful to be here and see so many of you. I'm really humbled also to have Adrian here with us. It's very nice. It's a kind of a sign of leadership to spend the evening. I know that you would have many other things to do as well, and that's why I think this is a very special occasion. I would also like to respectfully recognize the past and present owners of this land where we are right now. And I'm a humble servant of public education in many ways. And the things I try to do with you this evening is, first of all, I try to keep my own share brief, because I also want to learn from you. I want to hear what you have to say about these things. But there are two things I want to touch upon. One of them is that indeed, if we're looking at the evidence of educational policies and reforms around the world today, the evidence is very clear that investing in equity is the best strategy and policy to enhance overall performance of education systems. I'm not only speaking about Finland or any particular country, but if anybody is loyal and trusts the evidence, this is the conclusion. This is exactly what the OECD is saying right now, which has not always been the case. But I'll speak a little bit about that, what this equity in education means. And the kind of an interesting thing that we are seeing right now is that equity and excellence seem to travel together. And it's not like it used to be that you had to choose either one or the other. It's clear that we can do both of these simultaneously if we just put the right policies in place. The other thing I want to speak with you this evening is that we are living now the times when there's so much information and so much evidence, if you wish, around us, that we have to be, first of all, very careful. All the teachers and leaders and partners of education need to be very clear and very careful with the use of this evidence. If you're education minister or leader today anywhere, you can do almost anything you want and back that your policies and politics on evidence. There's so many things around that you can basically do whatever you want to do. And that's why we are seeing these often controversial policies around the world. People seem to be doing almost the opposite things. And everybody is finding evidence and data to support these things. So I'll show you a couple of examples of how this works, and just to give you a kind of a wake-up call that we need to be very much more aware of what's going on in the world right now if we want to move the right direction. Okay? How's my English? Is it okay? I'm sorry, I cannot speak Australian. I try to, but it doesn't work. Okay, so let me take this about half an hour's journey right now with you and start with a little kind of a history back to year 2000, because this is something. If we go about 13, 14 years back to year 2000, the world looked very different that time in terms of education. The whole landscape, the global geography of education was very, very different. You often hear from people working in the OECD, for example, in Paris, that whenever there was a meeting of education ministers of OECD countries, there were 32 members, I guess, that time in the OECD, and most of these ministers were believing and claiming that they have the best education system in the world. And this was obviously the time when the first OECD PISA results were published yet. And Finland was one of those countries, members in this OECD family, but we never thought that our education system is anything but average. You know, that was our kind of a dream in the year 2000. That we didn't want to be better than anybody else except maybe Sweden, our Western neighbor. But otherwise there were no other criteria than that. And why I'm telling you this, there are two reasons for this. One is that finally when the OECD released the first PISA results in December 2001, so this was the first time when there was a really kind of an OECD-wide data about the performance of education systems, not only the math and reading and science scores, but also in terms of many other things. It changed the whole world immediately, overnight. Because, first of all, none of those countries who were attending these OECD meetings and claiming and believing that they have the best education system in the world, well, there were countries like England and France and Germany and the United States and Sweden and Norway. They were spending a lot of money on those things. They were nowhere near where the PISA top was, okay? But even more interestingly, none of those countries that found themselves on the top of the OECD PISA league tables never wanted to be there. And this was a kind of an interesting question that, so what's happening in the world that seems to be so much different after this data was available than what people believed before that? And this is where two stories basically started to emerge. The other one was this story of successful education system, and Finland was part of that story. People started to ask questions like what Finland did or what Singapore was doing. Singapore was not there, but South Korea and some other Canadian provinces were there as well. That what was going on in these countries? Is there something common in those education systems? But then the other story was that what's happening in the education systems that have not been able to perform as good, okay? And there was a number of education systems there that were really disappointed with their outcomes. And when the PISA started to produce more information and more data in 2003, 2006, 2009, this kind of a pattern started to emerge. And that's where this, Angela, you were mentioning the global education reform movement, idea of the kind of a question that, so what is this movement, what is this global agenda? that many countries seem to be following that is not leading to good outcomes. Okay, and that's what I've been trying to figure out and do my research and intellectual work for the last 10 or 12 years actually to answer this question, that what are these things that are preventing many of the education systems from getting better. And Australia is sharing one of those things, some of those ideas. United States and England and New Zealand, the Netherlands, Sweden, they share some of these same characteristics of education, their educational performance. But by far the most interesting thing for me throughout this story has been this, how the role of equity in education. And equity, what I mean by equity here is exactly how the David Gonski's panel defines equity in education in this report, and how the OECD is defining what equity in education means. In other words, that we are looking at where the children come from, what type of home and circumstances they have, and how will they succeeding or failing in a school. Okay, so this is the story I try to share here with you. But let me say a couple of things about the Finnish kind of a situation there. And since year 2001, we have been asking, and people have been asking me also that, so what explains Finland's extraordinary performance, at least all the way until the PISA 2009? I have been asked today at least 4 or 5 journalists, and they all ask the same question. So what is the secret of Finland? And I always try to say that there's no secret, and you cannot really give the 5 factors or reasons behind this, that there's something else that is probably not visible. And that's why I'm calling this, I'm working on a new book called, the working title is Invisible Learning. It's a little bit like John Hattie's Visible Learning, but this is, I'm talking about the factors that you cannot see. But my kind of argument behind there is that if you want to understand the performance of school systems, just like John is talking about the performance of classrooms and schools based on the things that you can see, but I'm asking what are these things that we cannot see that may be driving some of these things. And just to give you some ideas so that we can keep in mind that Finland is in a way a very different place, and that there is no kind of a clear rational way of explaining why the country has been able to create an education system that is performing in a way. So the first one, and this is each of these include a little message also for Australia, and this first one is a particularly interesting and important one, because I argue that the first thing that you cannot see if you come to visit Finland, and many of you have been there, but one of these things that you cannot see is the kind of a historical line of thinking about education that has been very important in terms of where we are right now. And if you travel around the world, and maybe Adrian is one of those people here who have access to the educational leaders and ministers around the world, but if you ask the world's educational leaders that where do you try to get your education system to? What is your kind of a national system level call for this? I have met about 10, 15 education leaders who set their education goals exactly like this, that we want to be the best education system or among the 5 best systems in the world by somewhere in the future, okay? And I think that your previous government, the Prime Minister had the same type of goal. So what's wrong with this one? I think, first of all, I think this is a completely wrong way of thinking about education, because you should not drive the development of your education system by how good you are in terms of other countries. I think it should be always in terms of how good you are for your own children and parents and communities. And what is often happening with this type of goal is that you lose this sense of your own, serving your own people, and that's why I find this a kind of a little complicated goal. Whenever I meet the ministers or leaders who think like this, I said, are you sure that this is the best way to think about where you really want to go? What do you think this type of leadership would mean for schools or communities? This type of system would be probably asking questions like, how do we know that we are getting there? What type of data do we need so that we can kind of follow up that we are approaching that goal and so on. And it's not always something that the schools and children need. Okay, in Finland we have never had a goal like this, obviously, because this is the Finnish way and many other countries' way of thinking about, leading the educational system to the future. We have had since early 1970s a goal that sounds something like this: that we want to have a great school, good school system for all our children. And again, if you think about what this type of leadership means for the schools and communities, this minister, like many of our ministers before until now, they have been concerned about whether we have all the services available in every school for those children who need more help and support than the others, whether we have good schools in every school, whether we have good teachers in every school and good principals leading these schools. But what Finland has been particularly careful since early 1970s is that whether our schools are funded in a way that will help every school to help these children to be successful. And that's why I feel so warmly and strongly about this Konski's work, because when I read the Konski's recommendation in how the schools should be funded here in Australia, it's almost like reading the Finnish story. The way Finland has been thinking about this thing for a long time. So that's why, this is one of these things that you do not see in Finland, that how the country has been thinking systematically throughout the last 40 years about the development and improvement of this system, that we want to have a good school system and good school for every child. The other one is the overall performance of the country or the nation in general. Okay, I have met many people who seem to be thinking that Finland is only good in education. We have maybe a good ice hockey team and good schools, but that's it. There's nothing else here. So I started to ask this question and look a little bit kind of closely so how Finland as a country performs overall. And I had a kind of a certain assumption behind there that if it's true that the nation is doing well in many other areas, maybe there's nothing particular in education. Maybe we are asking the wrong question altogether. And I think most people are actually asking, when they think about Finnish education or many other countries' education, that it's not about education. It's about how people do things in the first place. Just to show you some of these global indexes and indicators that anybody can find easily if you want to take some time with the internet and Google, look at the World Economic Forum and OECD indicators for the economy and business. This is more related to how the country is performing in terms of innovation, technology, economy, governance, and those things. And you will see, again, if I use United States as a kind of a global benchmark, that the Finnish performance seems to be quite good in all of these areas. Let me show you some of these social indicators that come closer to families and children and women and education, but education is not included here. And again, you will see that the Finnish performance seems to be quite good, at least if we use United States as a benchmark here. Well, United States is not the best country in the world in terms of the social indicators, but certainly they think that they are best in the world in economy. But if you take a look at this, and just the one, this is not the unhappiness index. This is United Nations happiness index, but you can read it as an unhappiness index as well. But that's the important thing. But for example, this is one of my favorite things here. This political empowerment of women, and now when we are in Australia, this country was one of the first ones that issued women a political right to vote in the elections and also stand as a candidate. But there was one country that came before that, and that's tiny little Finland in up there north. And I think that if I can remember incorrectly, that the issue here in Australia was that not all the women got these rights immediately, that there was some part of probably Aboriginal part of the people here who didn't have the same rights. And that's why Australia is not the first country in the world, because in Finland we gave these rights immediately to all women in our country. But why this makes such a big difference if you walk into our parliament now and ask this question that how this country, this tiny little Nordic country has been able to, put forward and accept and approve all these wonderful policies and laws that makes Finland the best country to be a mother and give every family 12 months of parental leave and free daycare and free public education and all these things and health services. Many people say that the answer is very, very easy. That it's a women's, that we have so many women in our parliament. There's almost half of our members of the parliament and half of our cabinet ministers are women. And and that's why I think it's extremely important to keep this in mind. I don't know how relevant, how this echoes here in Australia, but when I speak about these things in the United States, I often say that, if you really want to change the system, if you really want to have a school system and society that is taking care of, that is designed for people and children, you have to have more women in politics. Otherwise, there are always, other priorities that will overrule, whether it's education or social policies, whatever it is, if you leave it to men to decide. I love education, and I think healthcare and all these things are important. But often, when there are too many men in a room, there are other priorities that we think are even more important than that, and that's why we need to be mindful with this. But I associate that much of this Finnish success and kind of a fact that we have been able to turn around the country and society fairly quickly to the fact that we have, not only that we have a lot of women in a parliament, but we have a legislation in a country that requires that every task force, committee, working group must have at least 40% of other gender. Whether it's about the defense, whether it's about healthcare or education or technology, we always have to include both genders evenly into these task forces. This has been there for the last 25, 30 years actually. It's the same thing in Sweden, Norway and Denmark, and I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about how important it is to give an equal voice to everybody. And then the third one is and this is another thing that you cannot see in the country, in Finland if you come there, is or any country, is the equality or inequality that we have. Why I'm raising this issue? I'm doing it because this is one of the most kind of a burning topics in the world. When the World Economic Forum met a few months ago in Switzerland, Davos, all these world economic leaders, they concluded that the most burning challenge that the world has right now is increasing inequality. Okay? And that's why I'm asking this question right now from you, is that how do you think income inequality, in other words, how the wealth is divided and shared among you people and us in Finland, is linked to educational performance? Is there any connection between wealth distribution and how children learn in the school system? What do you think? And which way? What's that? Uh-huh. Tell me more. Okay, let me ask you another question. Where do you think Australia would be here in this graph if the idea is that we have more unequal countries are here? I'm going to show you all the OECD countries here. So more unequal nations are here and more equal countries are on this side. And higher educational performance is up here. And if your country is not doing so well, it's going to be below this. This is the international average of these two variables. So where is Australia? Are you equal or unequal? Are you good or bad in learning? You're good, okay? So that's where you are, okay? Approximately, yeah? So you are a little bit above the international average in math and reading and science learning as the OECD is measuring it. But then you are a little bit on the negative side of the inequality, okay? This is where the United States is. America is one of those most unequal countries within the OECD. And this is where Finland is. And this is what makes us very different. people often tell me in America that, how can you compare Finland and United States because we are so different? And I said, yes, we are different. We speak different languages, but also we think very differently about how we share the wealth that we have. And Finland and USA are equally wealthy nations. Australia and Finland are also equally wealthy nations. But we think differently about how do we share this wealth that we have in the country among ourselves. This is Canada and all the other OECD countries. And you will see indeed that there is a kind of an interesting slight negative correlation dependency between income inequality and educational performance if it means the academic test results. Well, what does it mean? Obviously, you cannot make any causal conclusions out of this by saying that, more unequal, when the inequality gets worse, then the educational outcomes worse too. But it just indicates that the inequality is an issue for educators as well. So if you are an education leader or if you are a teacher who worries and cares about educational improvement, this is one of these things that we have to think about. Now, the OECD published an interesting report, a book called All on Board, about a month ago, and it has this type of conclusion, which is kind of a worrying thing, by saying that the income of the richest 10% of the population in OECD countries is about 10 times higher than that of the poorest 10%. Okay, so what does this mean? Just to give you an idea, 25 years ago, the number 10 here was 7. So this is how quickly the world is getting more unequal. This is about your country, which is a kind of a shameful thing, right? The richest 1% of Australians now own the same wealth as the bottom 60%. Yeah. Okay, so we need to do something in education, and the work of the educators and work of the schools is getting more and more complicated when the inequality increases. Okay, but then there's another thing, the equity and inequity, which is a different part of the story. Let me tell you, before I go to this equity question, say a few words about this use of evidence. Okay, so now I move to look at the more global issues of what do we know about world of education in general and how do we use the evidence. Well, my first notion here is that since we have so much information available, you can do almost anything you like, and you can choose the sources and resources and data as you wish, and then build your theories or policies as you want and back everything with the evidence. I'll show you three of my favorite things that education policymakers and politicians often want to look at. The first one of them, and these all come from this global educational reform movement idea. The first one is the role of competition and choice in education. Okay, this is probably the most common thing in a global educational reform movement, namely that people think that if only there's more competition between schools over enrollment and parents have more choice, things will somehow, at the system level, get better. One of the journalists today asked me exactly the same question, that what do I think about competition and choice as a policy drivers, and my response was that we have to look at research evidence, what the evidence is saying. It's not about my opinion about this thing. Okay, so I'm looking at these things at the three levels. One is the myth, the facts, and I must tell you that I lived 5 years in Washington, D.C. before, but I'm fine now. And in Washington, D.C., I learned one thing, that there are actually two types of things. There are facts, and then there are true facts. You know what I mean? In politics, there are facts and true facts. Okay, but here I'm just giving you these facts that are like things that we should assume that they are real. Okay, so the myth that is often mentioned, and this is something that comes from the early years of the English education reform in late 1980s, is that the kind of a belief that if only the schools were competing more and there's more choice, then somehow this will drive the improvement of the system, just like it improves the marketplace. Okay, so some of the facts, and many of these facts that you will see here are coming from the OECD data, and I'm using this OECD PISA and OECD data because it's extremely useful. So I'm not talking about these PISA league tables. I'm not interested in where Australia is compared to Finland or other countries. That's not what we should be looking at. But we need to look at some of these trends and evidence that is hidden behind these league tables that people normally don't want to see. So just to take a look at this. So the fact is that there is no evidence to suggest that private schools help to raise the level of performance of the school system as a whole. Okay, so this is what the OECD is, and that's not my idea or any single research. This is coming from the OECD. And then there's another one that says that school choice and competition are not related to improved performance. Okay, so if you ask this question, that is competition and choice good, you can provide this evidence and say that this is what the OECD is concluding based on the data from all 34 countries that we have now, including Australia, New Zealand, Finland, and all the others. Okay, but then there's a whole bunch of research also on this, and research is much more mixed because it depends on what type of case and what type of environment you are looking at. There are two kind of laboratories of competition and choice in the world. One is the case of Chile. That was a completely privatized system after during the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And there's a lot of research about this, how this type of privatization through vouchers works. Then there's another one from Sweden, and Sweden is another laboratory. In early 1990s, Sweden decided to they passed a piece of legislation that allowed so-called free schools or private schools to operate. This was a very liberal piece of legislation, meaning that basically anybody can run a school and you can make profit out of the public money. And often these private operators, they were skimming about 20 to 30% of the cost to their own pockets, and then the schools were run through public money. With this remaining thing. Angela was there a couple of weeks ago, and you can speak more about that if you want. But there's a lot of research also about the Swedish case, and it's a very clear. It's saying that the promises that were made in Sweden in early 1990s have not been fulfilled. That the quality of our education system has not improved, but the equity has been disappearing. Okay, and this has been a kind of a catastrophe in Sweden, that they have lost the equitable base of education system. Sweden used to be 20 years ago. Sweden was one of the model education systems in the world, high quality and very equitable education system, but not anymore. And you can take a look at this research if you want to. There's another one from New Zealand. People from North Carolina, Duke University did a good study about the New Zealand case, and they concluded something like this, that the competition and choice generated negative effects on the quality of student learning and other aspects of schooling in New Zealand. And there are a number of studies that you can find in a similar way. But you can also find research studies that are saying that there have been minor or more positive impact of competition and choice. So research is much more mixed on this. The other one is the test-based accountability question, that is it good to insist that the schools are held more and more accountable using standardized assessments and tests? This is something that you are doing here to some extent in Australia through your NAPLAN system, which may be good or bad. I don't know about that, and I don't have any evidence here. But you know, this is what Michael Gove said about a year ago in the Parliament House in England. He said that with the sharper accountability, we can create an education system which can compete with the best in the world. Okay? So whatever this sharper accountability means, it's a very careful use of words, because he didn't say stronger accountability or tougher accountability, he said sharper accountability. But obviously it means that if we are holding teachers and schools more accountable, then things will get better. So what do we know? What do we know about if we look at the OECD, the PISA data? There's a lot of references to this. This is from the most recent one. that was published about 6 months ago. This says that school systems that grant more autonomy to schools to define and elaborate their curricula and assessments tend to perform better than systems that don't grant such autonomy. Okay, so autonomy and accountability, of course, are the things that often go together. But what is interesting in this OECD conclusion is that for the first time, OECD is saying that when there's autonomy together with accountability, that is associated to schools and teachers' right or access to decide what they're going to teach, how the curriculum will look like, and how students are evaluated, the things seem to be getting better. Again, research is interesting. There's a couple of examples from the research studies. The first one says that the research to date suggests that the benefits of test-based incentive programs over the past 2 decades have been quite small. Okay, this is a huge study in the United States, and the other one, there are increasing number of studies that are now showing how these incentive-based policies are leading to corruption and kind of a misbehavior at the level of the schools, and there's a whole number of those. You can find them all around the world right now, which is a kind of alarming trend and development. And then finally, I think our favorite thing is this teacher quality thing that is much more complicated. That's why I don't have a myth and fact, but I have lies, and there are much more lies and myths than there are facts around this issue, and this is becoming very, very common. The first lie is that the most important single factor in improving quality of education is teachers. And surprisingly, you can find this in the many policy documents. People are saying that teachers are the most important thing, and that's why we have to do certain things. So what do we do? What is the kind of a main thing we need to do? Of course, find the bad teachers and fire them. Yeah? So this is the conclusion. It's not to help and support all these teachers to do better, but it's the system to evaluate teachers and find the bad, poor-performing teachers and then fire them and bring smart young people into the schools. That's why we have this emerging, very rapidly increasing programs of Teach for America, Teach All. Do you have Teach for Australia? What is it called? Teach Australia. Yeah, it's the same idea. Let's bring some smart young people from the good universities and they teach for a couple of years and things will get better. Okay? The myth, and this is again something that many people believe. You can find this interestingly in many places in the OECD reports that says that the quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. The conclusions are exactly the same. That if you believe that this is true, then obviously the challenge is how to improve the quality of your teachers, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to get rid of your bad teachers, okay? Or build in a system that will continuously give you data about the teacher's performance so that you know what they are doing. I think these are both not true, they are not correct. I think teaching is I'm a teacher myself, or used to be a school teacher, and I know that teaching is a team sport. Right? It's like rugby. Don't know too many things about cricket. I don't know if it's a team sport or not. But I know something about rugby and Australian football. And I know that you cannot be successful unless you play as a team, that you play together. And you have a mission, you have a leadership and coach, and you work together for those things. And teaching in a school is exactly the same thing. So what is the research saying? This is probably the most radical conclusion tonight from the research, and surprisingly poorly known by people, including teachers and educators around the world, that how much actually of the variation of students' learning and performance in a school can be associated to in-school factors, in-school variables in general. There's a lot of research about this again, and this is probably one of the most reliable recent study by Dan Goldhaber and his team in Washington State in the United States, where they conclude that all school input combined, including teacher quality and all the other things, this accounts for approximately 21% of student outcomes. Okay? So this means that the rest is associated in the outer school factors. The family, the student's individual characteristics, peer influence, many other things that teachers and schools have no control over, okay? Some other research studies are indicating a little bit larger proportion of the variation associated to in-school factors, but even in the extreme cases, it normally doesn't go further than 40%, okay? So it's fair to say that about 1/3 of what the students learn in the school can be explained by the things that the school is doing, and about half of that 1/3 somehow relate to teacher issues, okay? Teacher and the curriculum and the classroom, whatever happens there, and then the other half to general school factors like leadership, for example, that is very important, okay? So we cannot really say that it's all about teachers. We cannot have education policies that put the teacher as the most important thing. I'm not saying that teachers wouldn't be important. Of course they are, we all know that. But we cannot conclude that teachers would overcome, for example, issues like poverty or some other things. So let me wind up here and take us back to this question of what is equity, what do we mean by equity, or in this case, what do we mean by successful education system or school system? Let me ask you this before I tell you what do I think we should be looking at, and ask you this, what would you look at in the education system if you were to judge whether it's a good, successful or not successful, or high performing or not high performing? So what are the things that should be included there? Learning outcomes, obviously, right? We have to see whether kids are learning. If nobody's learning in the school system, it cannot be a successful or good quality. Equity is another thing, all right? Any other things that comes to your mind?
Retention and attendance.
Say it again?
Retention and attendance.
Okay, good. Participation, how many people go into the system? How many of them are successfully going through, graduating, taking part in the system, including the adults, right? Something else?
I think we know it's not a level playing field, so the supports in place, I think, are really, really important.
Say again?
The supports in place.
Okay, good. Mm-hmm. Something else?
Needs-based.
What's that?
Needs-based support, so that those students have the greatest need get
Okay,
extra support.
good.
Expert support as well.
Yeah,
Facilities,
but let me include money here, because that's what all the ministers and education leaders, they are held accountable for how much money you have in the budget and what do you get out of this. So it's it's probably increasingly important that we have a system that is run efficiently, right? That you get some things out. It's not a question of, like, people ask me here in Australia that should you have more money in your budget? Should you spend more money in education? And I think it's a wrong question again. It's not about how much money you spend. Here in this country, I think it's a better question to ask, where do you put the money that you have available right now? And if you look at the funding in Australia, it's kind of surprising to me to see how much money is spent on those who already have a lot. Okay? Or did I miss a meeting? Okay, this is the last and final exercise for you to think about. This is by far my favorite way of looking at the excellence or quality and equity. And this is something that we couldn't do without the OECD PISA data. So that's why, if you're struggling yourself with a question that is the OECD PISA good or bad, always think about this, that if you think that the OECD PISA is an unnecessary bad thing to do, then you can forget this understanding of how quality and equity are actually linked. So I'm not interested in these league tables. That's something that I leave it to some other people. But this is a particularly important way of seeing how the equity and quality are linked. So let me explain to you what it is here. So equity is defined as the Gonski panel defines equity. This is exactly their definition, that is a strength of the relationship between children's family background and how successful they are in a school. Okay, so how family socioeconomic background explains or is linked to students' learning. Okay, and OECD is using this economic, social, and cultural status index that it basically calculates for every child a certain number based on the parents' occupation and wealth and education and many other things, so that we can do this thing. So more equitable systems are here. So we are again looking at the OECD countries and their education systems. So more equitable education systems are here, and less equitable systems are right here. And again, if you have a higher learning outcomes, nationally it's here, and below average is here. And again, my same question to you is that where Australia is right now. Just to make sure that you understand what this image is. Where do you think Australia is? Where, left? Adrian, do you have an idea? It's a little bit like in a school. But I always ask those pupils who are sitting in the front row, they always know everything, right?
No, I think it's to the right of the dot.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's right there. Correct, yes. But you know, the interesting thing with Australia is, first of all, if you take the different states and the territories here, it's not so simple, this image there. Some of them are, like I was in Western Australia, they have this beautiful black swan type of thing. So the black swan would have been somewhere here. So it's a little bit better than Australia as a whole in terms of the students' outcomes, but there's a more inequity there, okay? Victoria would be probably a little bit over here, like New South Wales. I think you would be there too. But the point here with Australia is that if you ask the question that where this flag was 12 years ago or 15 years ago, okay? Because one thing you know that the learning, the national averages here in Australia and all the states and territories have been declining, okay? So you have the same trend that Finland has right now, and England and the United States and Canada and New Zealand and many other countries have had. It may be for many reasons. But you know, the key thing here is that if we, and I'm not doing this because I don't have the exact numbers, okay? But the trend, most likely, the situation has been that Australia was somewhere here 15 years ago, okay? And so another question is that, is the problem here declining quality or worsening equity? Okay, how do you know that? I think you believe rather than know. Okay, let me show you this. Because if this is the case, then we are looking at a very different challenge, okay? Because this can be a quality problem. Some people say that, like when I read the newspapers about your education, there's some politicians who say that the quality of Australian education, schools, is declining. And when I read this news, I'm always asking myself, how do you know that? How do you know that it's a quality that is declining? Because it can also be that the equity is getting worse and it's kind of a pulling down, tracking the quality with it, okay? But we don't know yet, okay? This is where United States is, this is England, Canada. You know, Canada is different because Canada is very much like Australia, but it's a very different performer. And I call this place where Canada is, I call it heaven. Everybody wants to be heaven. Heaven is a place where quality and equity meet. You have them both at the same time. So Canada is a kind of a rare example of those education systems. And Canadian systems, even if you take most of the Canadian provinces, they're all here. They're very close, very near here. Alberta, BC, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Quebec, they're all very close. They're very, very near there. Sweden and Norway and Denmark and all the others, these are all the OECD countries. And now you will see that even if you don't recognize all these flags, you will see that there are other guys there in heaven too. This is South Korea, Japan, and little tiny Estonia, just about 50 miles south from Finland. Okay, so are there any Estonians in the room? Not yet, okay? So these guys, these are the ones, the education systems where equity and quality meet. And this is ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of a new understanding that we have through the global data. This is the first time a few years ago when we started to realize that it is actually possible to have equity and quality simultaneously, okay? But do you see Finland here? Do you remember how Finnish flag looks like? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It's the most beautiful flag in the world. Okay, you know, this is the line. So if you take some of these outliers away from here, this is Italy, Sweden, this is Iceland and Norway. It seems to be that there's a kind of a rule here that the equity and quality somehow go together, which is a very interesting type of thing. So here you have these school systems that OECD calls them as successful education systems, strong equity and high quality simultaneously. This is where Finland was 40 years ago. And I'm saying this because 40 years ago what we decided to do is to remove all the private schools and just build a kind of a comprehensive school system where all the children will go to the similar types of schools. And make no mistakes, we have choice, so parents can choose the school, but the Finnish way is that we provide our parents an option to choose between public school and public school. Yeah? But they are not all the same, okay? So not all these public schools are exactly the same, because they are like many of those. I hear that you have this thing called independent public schools. Right? And we have those independent public schools. All our schools are independent public schools because they can flexibly decide what type of curriculum they want to have based on the national framework. Okay, so that's why it's a little bit different way of thinking about this thing. So I'll show you now what has happened. If you look at this little flag here, I'll show you what has happened during the last 40 years. This is the Finnish way. Right now. This is where we were here like 2006 or 7 or 8. It almost went out of the heaven, back to the earth. Yeah, but the significance of this Finnish story is that you see these first 2 decades here, 70s and 80s when we were coming here. Those were the 2 decades when we were really building the equity, investing heavily on the system to be good for all the children. And you know what? The first thing that we decided to do was to make sure that we have resourcing our schools based on the needs. Okay? And this is where we get very close to what the Konski review panel also proposed for your schools. So Finland has been doing this for the last 30 years at least. Okay? The other things that we did in the 70s and 80s was to make sure that we have a special education system universally in every school, for every child, every day, that we have healthcare and school meals and counseling and support for all the children everywhere, systematically throughout the system. And that we have a balanced curriculum, I think it's very important, and that we protected our schools from toxic standardized assessment system, yeah? Because many people like me believe, and I know actually, that if you have a kind of a hard-handed external standardized assessment system that is only looking at math and reading and science, it will be bad for equity of the system, because it only provides an opportunity to be successful for those children who happen to be good in math and reading and science, or interested in these things, or if their parents happen to be valuing these things. And that's why people often think that the kind of a heavy reliance on academic standardized assessments is enforcing inequity. And that's why we need to be very mindful with these things, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? So here are these usual suspects that people are nowadays often referring to. Many countries would like to be like Shanghai or Singapore. But one of these things that they are missing is that Shanghai and Singapore both are very unequal or inequitable in terms of how children's family background is affecting or not affecting the educational performance. Okay, so this is how the world looks like right now. It's a very interesting thing, and the conclusions that we can make from this is my final evidence to you. And again, this is something that comes from the global international evidence, not from my own research or my own thinking. The first one is that this is what the PISA 2012 says, that the greater autonomy over curricula and assessment seem to improve performance. Okay, so it's not about autonomy for schools to hire and fire teachers and decide their budgets. It's about autonomy over the things that are really important for the schools. Second one, and this comes from the OECD's Quality and Equity study and report, it says that most successful education systems are those that combine equity with quality. Very simple statement, okay? So if you believe that, that's the way to go. Again, the PISA study says that poverty explains up to 46% of the PISA math score in the OECD countries. Up to 46% is associated to poverty, children's poor conditions at home. Okay, so it's not about teachers, it's not about bad teachers or poor schools. It's something that the schools and teachers have very little to do. Again, the Quality and Equity report says that we need to invest more heavily in schools in disadvantaged communities, which are overwhelmingly public schools. Here in Australia, you know this much better than I do, that about 80% of your children with the particular needs or those who are coming from the disadvantaged backgrounds are served by public schools, right? So that's why for this country, this OECD conclusion is particularly important. And let me close here. Sorry to take a little bit more time than I planned, but I guess that we have some time to have a chat, okay? I'm very happy to listen to your comments or your questions and have a little conversation here before we move on. Thank you.
Pasi, and I should have introduced myself at the outset. I'm Gary Zadkovich, Deputy President of the Teachers Federation, and we do have 10 minutes for questions if people wish to ask something of Pasi now.
You know, the Finnish school system is very individualized. I often say that Finland has probably the most individualized school system in the world, because the second article of our education law says that, it says something like this, that schools need to be organized. What does it say? No, it says that the education has to be organized according to the needs of each and every child. Okay? So this means that if you're a school principal in Finland, one of your kind of main concerns as a school head is that you have individualized services and approach in place in your school. In other words, that you take every child as an individual, okay? So that's why we do not have a thinking like that there's a kind of a grade level performance like in many other countries. When they come to see our schools, they say, how many of your fourth graders are reading at the grade level? And this is a kind of a meaningless question in Finland, because the teacher will say, I don't know what you mean, but most of my kids, they like to read. They like what they do. And that's why we try to approach everything through kind of an individual approach and individual basis. So if you have students who have more needs, that they will be helped. And this is exactly why we have a funding system for our schools, where there are more of those students who need individual help and support and attention, that they have more resources, so that they can have smaller class sizes, they can have more staff there, assistant teachers available for the normal classrooms and so on. So I don't know any other way to answer this equity question except that the individualized approach is a very helpful policy. You know, it's interesting because thank you for this question. Finnish teachers' salary in my country is regarded as very close to the national average salary overall. So if you ask this question in Finland, teachers would say that my salary is what people normally get in this country with the similar degrees. So, but then and also in the OECD countries, if you look at how much Finnish teachers earn compared to other OECD countries, it's very close to the OECD average as well. So it's fair to say that the Finnish teachers, they have the kind of average salary, whatever it means. Teacher education, you know, we have a 35-year tradition to have academic teacher education that requires advanced university degree, including primary school teachers, which is a kind of a foundation of the Finnish school system. And that's why the entry requirements into primary school teacher education or teacher education in general are exactly the same as entry requirements to any other academic program, whether it's a law or medicine or business or humanities or whatever it is in our universities. A big difference between Australia and Finland when it comes to teacher education here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, we had a conversation about this with Adrian, is that we are in Finland, because everything is paid by government, you know, all the higher education, everything is paid by the government. So if you are the government, obviously you don't want to train any more teachers than you actually need. And this is something that is often kind of ignored when people look at the Finnish teacher education, because we are preparing teachers exactly the number that we need in our labor markets. Okay, so if you decide to become a teacher, and it's a different thing than if you decide to become a lawyer or something else, because if you choose teaching in our current system, you can be absolutely sure that you have a job. Okay, because there will be about that number of new teachers graduating 5 or 6 years from now, then there will be openings in the labor markets. Okay, so that's why we have about 10 times more applicants into our teacher education programs than there are places, so we can select very carefully those that are trained. I know that Australia and many other countries are training many more teachers than you need. You're working on that. Oh, good. It's a very, very important aspect of this, because I'm sure that you're going to get much more interested young people seeking for teacher education and teaching profession if they have a kind of a more guarantees that they will find a job when they graduate. The same thing in England and Ireland. They have the same type of issue. Canada has the same problem, that there are many more young people available in the labor market. They are looking for jobs than there are vacancies, and that's why it's not going to be good for young teachers. You know how we think in Finland about education is that most people, the vast majority of educators, and most of our politicians and people who are in education administration think sincerely that education, particularly school education, it's the kind of a business of cooperation and networking and sharing and doing things together. And if you want to have a concrete kind of an example, how does this look like? There are many of our politicians and legislators in our parliament seem to think that it's their responsibility to protect our schools, and particularly our children in our schools, from the unhealthy competition that is often taking place when we introduce certain education policies, for example, related to how children are assessed or graded. And just to give you an example of kind of a concrete thing that our legislators did already 25 years ago. They decided in their wisdom that giving grades to young children is not a good idea. Okay? So we have a law still, and I think it will actually continue to be, that we can only grade our pupils when they are old enough, meaning when they are at least in grade 5, when they are 12 years old. But since we have this flexible and kind of individualistic, customized approach into our schooling, we are also leaving this decision to each and every school to make, that when do they think their pupils and children are ready to receive grades. Okay? But the law requires that no school can do it before the 5th grade. So all the way until the 5th grade, and children go to school in Finland when they're 7. Okay? So all these first 4 years, or first 4 or 5 years, all our pupils receive only a kind of a descriptive evaluation from the school, okay? Rather than grade A, B, C, D, E, or number or something that would enable them to compete against one another. Often parents are competing through their children's grades over the dinner table, you know what I mean? But we are kind of our laws are protecting people from this type of unhealthy competition that we think is not part of the raising children or educating them in the school. And there are many other things that we, through our policies and laws, we try to make sure that there is not this type of unhealthy competition that would lead to situations that are not good for children.
Thank you, Pasi. Look, I want to draw this evening to a close, and I do want to acknowledge that we've had, we invited people from far and wide for this forum tonight. For example, I know we've got members of the media here, journalists, we've got senior department officers, we've got parents, teachers, principals, community members, a broad range of people, members of Parliament, and we've got the peak principal groups represented as well. And I'm sure on behalf of all gathered here tonight, Pasi, I can extend our great appreciation for your presentation this evening. When we sit here and hear you present, we are struck by your great wisdom, your experience, your intellect, and of course it's not lost on us your great commitment to the values of justice, equality, fairness for all children. And we know that we will take great strength from your leadership in continuing to campaign in this country, in Australia, for an education system that ensures that every child has the right to have their educational needs met through a well-funded public education system. So for your inspiration, we much appreciate that. And I'm sure when we look at the title of your book, Finnish Lessons, we have learnt from you tonight. And it's our hope that through the Gonski School funding reforms, which we will do everything we can to ensure are fully implemented in this nation, I just hope that with the implementation of Gonski and coupled with the inspiration of colleagues like yourself, we can help our students climb up into that top right-hand corner, the area that you referred to as heaven. Thank you.